shook the country in the early 2000s. After a lost decade of neoliberal hegemony from 1985 to 1999, diverse movements emerged in Bolivia against the same policies. The cycle of protests began in 1999 in Cochabamba against the privatization of water. It was followed by the rebellion of Achacachi in 2000 by indigenous highland peasants, and the popular insurrections demanding the nationalization of gas followed in 2003 and 2005 that finally led to the overthrow of two neoliberal presidents and the landslide election victory of the first indigenous president, Evo Morales. The current government has been commanding extraordinary electoral support by Bolivian standards. Sunday Bolivia goes to vote again, and very few doubt that Evo Morales is going to win again. However, despite this fact, acts of protest continue all over Bolivia. How do we explain this paradox of continuity of protests and the continuity of the stability of the political regime? If the cycle of protests in the early 2000s kept weakening the hegemony of the older neoliberal regime, leading to its phenomenal defeat and overthrow, why has it not been doing the same to the new political regime? In this context, the distinction between populist and institutionalist politics made by Ernesto Laclau becomes important. Populist politics for Laclau refers to the construction of a people through the formation of chains of equivalences between diverse democratic demands. Chains of equivalences dissolve the particularities of each demand and redefine all of them as demands against the system. It leads to the construction of a common negative identity based on opposition to a common enemy and the division of society into opposed camps. Institutionalist politics, on the other hand, refers to the process whereby each demand is put forward separately in a piecemeal fashion without altering the existing consensus, and the regime is able to absorb the demands into the system. The politics from 1999 to 2005 in Bolivia can be characterized as populistic. Demands for public works, access to water, an economic policy that reduces inequality and privileges citizens over transnational corporations, nationalization of natural resources, and the struggle against racial discrimination and structural racial inequalities were linked through the construction of a chain of equivalence against the regime. In that context, each demand overflew its own particularity and became redefined as demands against the system. This led to the division of the society into opposed camps. All the indigenous popular sectors against the neoliberal regime that represented the white mestizo elites in alliance with transnational capital and the US Embassy. The symbol of the gringo president comes to the fore in most people's memories of that period, and this symbol served the purpose of increasing the populist polarization. It refers to Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada, the Bolivian president who had grown up in the United States, spoke Spanish with an American English accent like Buenas noches, championed neoliberalism, and unambiguously sided with transnational corporations against the interests of Bolivian citizens, especially that of the indigenous popular sectors. As he emerged as a supreme symbol of white racism, US imperialism, and neoliberal capitalism, the struggle against all the three was constructed as one struggle of the people against the regime. Each local or particular struggle got constructed and read as a larger struggle against the political regime. This turned out to be a populist moment par excellence. With the election of Evo Morales, the cycle of indigenous national popular mobilizations came to an end. However, that did not lead to an end to protests. The predominance of acts of protests as a primary means of political expression and political communication between the citizens and the government has created what I call a political culture of protests in Bolivia. This can be explained by two factors. Firstly, we need to consider the legitimacy given by the government to social movements. The government calls itself a government of social movements and has a vice ministry of coordination with social movements. A government that rose to power on the basis of the acts of protests, roadblocks, and mass demonstrations has less moral authority to delegitimize or penalize acts of protests. Whenever they did so or tried to do so, the protesters quickly reminded them of what brought them to power. Another reason for the existence of a culture of protests in Bolivia is that the neoliberal era left behind a legacy that converted protests into the major and at times the only means of political expression. The gap between the people's aspirations and the state's priorities in the neoliberal era created a culture where a popular belief emerged that the state will be deaf to people's demands unless the road is blocked or an office occupied. Though in many cases the participants in these protests are strong supporters of the government, they mobilize for particular interests. However, they remain demands the system can absorb and therefore remain within the boundaries of institutionalist politics. The demands remained within the confines of their own particularity and did not link up with other demands to form a chain of equivalence against the system. Most of the acts of protest in contemporary Bolivia have to do with the legacy of neoliberalism. As Goldstein notes, though the residents of urban peripheries, especially in Andean Bolivia, support government schemes like direct cash transfers, nationalization, and land reform, however limited these are, they are critical of some enduring neoliberal tendencies of the Bolivian state. Several acts of protest in contemporary Bolivia have to do with the legacy of neoliberal policies in education, health, transport, and security. There have been constant protests in the city of El Alto demanding breakfast for school children, increase in school teacher posts in public schools, improvement in the quality of public hospitals, better public transportation, and so on. Though the participants in these protests are strong supporters of the government, they mobilize aggressively for particular interests. Sometimes the state intervenes favorably and at other times partially. For example, when the protesters in El Alto demanded death penalty for muggers, they did not accede to it but took some steps to control crime by installing CCTV cameras in the central parts of the city. When the Federation of Parents Associations in El Alto protested demanding teaching posts for computer science in public schools, the government, instead of acceding to that demand, decided to train other teachers in the schools to teach the subject. In some cases, various popular sectors mobilize against each other. For example, when the minibus owners block roads in one part of the city demanding a hike in bus fares, residents organized by neighborhood associations stage another roadblock against the minibus owners in another part of the city. Sometimes one group protests, the government accedes to that demand, and then it becomes a turn of the other group to block the roads the next day. So in such cases, the government generally tries to strike a balance between opposing forces. Most of the demands were unevenly absorbed into the system. However, when the system fails to absorb most of the demands into the system, and when that happens consistently, the system comes under pressure and the demands turn into floating signifiers that can be articulated with other demands to form a new chain of equivalence against the existing system. That would signal the beginning of a populist political process. One reason why that did not happen in places like El Alto is that the chain of equivalence between all indigenous national popular sectors that was constructed during the neoliberal era is not yet dead. I'm just trying to race against time. So. It remains dormant, meaning the old chain of equivalence against the neoliberal regime. It remains dormant in the form of a united opposition to the traditional neoliberal parties that represent the oligarchy, as people constantly talk of preventing a return of right-wing parties to power. Before the election of Evo Morales as president, the logic of equivalence against the oligarchy was more prominent as the right wing was in power. However, after Morales' election victory, the indigenous popular sectors in Andean Bolivia feel that favorable government is in power, and therefore the logic of equivalence fades into the background as something that becomes legible only when the threat of the rightist opposition returning to power is invoked. But the most important reason why these demands did not turn into a new chain of equivalence against the regime is that people see Evo's victory as a major change and the government as generally favorable. They feel that the government has included indigenous people in the nation for the first time in history. They see the occupation of high offices by indigenous people, the law against racism, infrastructure projects in rural indigenous communities, and direct cash transfers as major achievements of the government. Here, indigeneity, I'm mainly talking of Andean Bolivia and the highland indigenous people. In that case, indigeneity ceases to be an organizing principle of resistance against the regime. Nevertheless, a moment emerged in Bolivia when it seemed that the new chains of equivalences that could challenge the existing regime were possible. Now I turn to that moment. So I don't have time to explain a lot of it, but basically I refer to two moments. One was the struggle against the move to construct a highway across the Tipnis National Park. And then the other was a protest over pensions led by the Confederation of Trade Unions. The Tipnis protest has a lot to do with what we discussed a lot today, and especially with my resource paper, the whole critique of development and a different kind of approach towards nature and so on. And then, the protest over pensions were led by the Central Obrera Boliviana, again, and So they protested against the government demanding an increase in pensions for public sector employees to make it equivalent to 100% of their last salaries. The struggle over pensions can be seen as a continuation of various struggles by the trade unions during the Morales presidency, demanding nationalization of more mines and increases in salaries by a greater rate than what the government offered. After these two major protests, there were possibilities that the political sectors that had a radical critique of the government would form a chain of equivalence against the system, pushing it in a more radical direction. There were calls made for unity between the Trade Union Confederation, the CONAMAG, the Highland Indigenous Organization against the government, and the CIDOB, that's a Lowland Indigenous Organization against the government. There was a political meeting in the city of La Paz that brought together various radical indigenous and left organizations, and the plan was to construct a political alternative to the mass government. They laid out political proposals including 100% nationalization of natural resources, expropriation of transnational corporations without compensation, radical land reforms that would eliminate the latifundistas as a class, defense of autonomous indigenous territories like the Tipnis, and so on. However, these efforts did not take off. And there are various reasons for it. One was ideological conflicts between the older Marxists who dominated the trade unions, and then the new kind of indigenous activists who led the struggle over Tipnis. And then the second thing was also caudillismo, like all of them wanted to be the leaders and wanted to be the next president, right? So then there cannot be a chain of equivalence. And so the important question that rises in this context is, why were the oppositional forces not able to form a new chain of equivalence against the government and turn the process of change in Bolivia in a more radical direction? I argue that it's an inability of organizations like the Central Obrera Boliviana and the CIDOB to create a hegemonic alliance with other popular sectors who are also engaged in acts of protests. So I basically refer to Gramsci's concept of hegemony, which basically takes hegemony from the Leninist framework, which saw hegemony as an act of leading a class alliance. So he basically, for him, hegemonic relations are relations that alter the identity of the classes entering into the alliance, and where compromises are made between different sectors. That way it's a more democratic concept of hegemony. So the Tipnis struggle and the protests of the COP could have projected a more radical alternative if they had followed this logic of hegemonic politics. However, they remained sectoral demands with which other sections of society could not identify. Rather than frame the issue in terms of radicalizing the process of change and increasing the pace of moving towards the post-neoliberal future, the discourse of the Central Obrera remained focused on the question of salary and pension increases for workers in the formal sector. This alienated the informal sector workers who formed the majority of the workforce, and also the rural peasants. And to conclude, the most important thing the Bolivian experience reveals is that the potentiality of any act of protest to cause political transformations and the degree and pace of those transformations depend to a large extent on their ability to construct chains of equivalences against the existing regime through hegemonic articulations. This approach goes against the analysis of protest popularized by a range of scholars like Hartenegri and Virno, who end up romanticizing the potential of small decentralized movements to cause structural transformations at all levels of politics, including the global. As Escobar argues, there is a dispersion of power with the proliferation of non-state social spaces and forms of organizations like the neighborhood microgovernments in El Alto, and the state is not the only way of instituting social power. However, it's also important to note that the organizations that create these forms do not stand for a withdrawal from state institutions. Despite creating thriving non-state forms, the demands made by organizations are mostly directed at the state. Even the lowlands indigenous movements that demand radical autonomy participate in the electoral process and try to create a synergy between electoral and non-electoral politics. The only way they feel the state could be decentered is by capturing state power and using that power to create non-state forms of social and political organization, rather than a non-engagement with the institutions of the state. So I would conclude by saying that this is a lesson the Bolivian experience could offer to the range of Occupy movements and other movements at the global level, like the Indignados in Spain. Okay. Thank you.
And now we're going to hear from our two discussants. First, Robert Sandwich from Union College.
Thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here today as part of the Tahrir Moments Working Group. I wanted to thank the organizers again and thank the panelists. My name's Robert. I'm trained as an anthropologist. I've worked in Venezuela since 2006. And I had an opportunity to read all three of these papers and digest them. There's not nearly enough time to go over all of them. They all merit serious discussion and debate. I'm going to do a disservice to all of them and try to link them to just one broader theme that I'll try to discuss in 4 minutes. I'm going to take that theme as what I see to be the core of Raphael's question, and I want to pose it across all of the questions, across all of the papers, and that is, what kinds of collective subjects? What's the wind that's blowing out the candles? What kind of collective subject is born at the intersection of the political economy of extractivism and the political practice of protest? Latin America is a fabulous place to ask this question, and these all papers engage with it at different moments in a national historical trajectory. We have Peru, we have Bolivia, we have Venezuela. And they're also couched against a historical moment that seems international in scope. So let me start with Raphael's paper. The tone feels familiar. I recognize the attitude of expectation and hope from Venezuela. I also recognize it from 2011 and the start of the Tahrir Moment Working Group. Since Raphael has given us 6 theses, I just wanted to add a 7th. And it's in the spirit of theses, it's a little bit obscure, but I've thought it through pretty seriously. And it's that biopolitics is a code word for democracy, or more precisely, it's a code word for popular sovereignty. If we're against biopolitics, if biopolitics is the bad guy, then we are by extension against democracy as popular sovereignty, and that's okay. But the question is, what next? And that's precisely the title of this paper, right? Esa democracia ya no es democracia. And that's a very key issue that we're working with. And if anyone wants me to go over this thesis at another point, I will. I'm sticking my neck out here. But I think that this is what Raphael is asking. I also think it's what Bonnie Honig, in her presentation yesterday, was trying to get at. I think that was what this first panel was wrestling with in a certain way. And I also think that this is one way of reading the ontological turn sympathetically. So let me turn to Tata's presentation, which is also dealing very much with democracy and with popular sovereignty. I work very closely with Laclau in my own research. And he's talking here about the key political practice in Bolivia, which is the formation of these chains of equivalence through which populist projects can capture the state apparatus. I'd point out here, and arguments get worked through, this one's a little bit tautological. Tata defines a successful political project as one that manages to create these chains of equivalence for a hegemonic consensus. The reason that the Marxists and the anti-developmental developmentalists were unsuccessful in Bolivia is that they failed to do so. Now, I'm not opposed to this as a reading of political faith, but it puts you in a paradoxical relationship to the very political practice that you're ostensibly describing. What's wrong, after all, with a protest that's not hegemonic, one that makes demands and then recedes, that fights its allies without destroying them, one that makes incremental gains and sometimes suffers devastating losses? Those more theoretical questions translate into practical ones about protests and extractivism in Bolivia. And as the paper is currently framed, it seems to be taking a stand against indigenous and environmentalist protest movements, and I don't think that that's what you're really aiming to do. And if you are trying to do this, does this devolve into a might makes right argument? And what kind of politics can one imagine going forward from here? Now, I'd suggest that I'm more sympathetic to Tata's argument than I'm letting on here. I'm not. It's very easy to poke holes in a paper, and that's not really my intention here. My intention is to bring out one of the problems when we start talking and thinking about protest movements in terms of popular sovereignty. And I would suggest that that's the strand of concordance that links Tata's work with George's. So let me go very quickly to George's analysis. He doesn't mention extractivism here, but it's absolutely central to understanding the fate of popular political struggles in Venezuela. Oil is the elephant in the room in Venezuela, one that the Bolivarian Revolution never adequately addressed. Instead, the problem was buried. Why? How? What are the consequences? Let me just run down this very quickly. The why is fairly simple. Almost no one in Venezuela is opposed to the extraction of oil rents, aside from a very, very small number of environmentalists and indigenous activists. And when I say small, I mean very small. Resistance to oil extraction is almost unheard of. In fact, if there is such a thing as a popular revolutionary subject in Venezuela, it's not one that's opposed to oil rents, it's one that's built on top of it. So then the question becomes, if we're going to start thinking about solidarities, about alliances between places like Venezuela and Bolivia, what happens when the popular revolutionary subject is constituted in antithesis in some ways to one another? It also poses, I think, George's paper poses the problem of government. And I would say that the government of popular insurgency is also, it's great in theory, this is also the problem that you run into when a government is based on popular sovereignty. I would agree with just about everything you set out in this piece. I agree that Badiou's vision of the riot is off. I agree that you've spotted the chink in Velasco's persuasive protests. I'd also agree that the protests in Venezuela are of a right-wing variety, and that it's probably not wise to put blind faith into protest like this. What I disagree with, however, is the way that you're going to, in the process, flatten the terrain of political struggle into two camps. It is no doubt effective. There are days and situations in which I am absolutely desperate to do the same thing. However, I'm concerned that the solidarity that it creates, particularly in the Venezuelan context and particularly at this particular moment, is one that can't fully function now that it's in power. It shrinks the space of dissensus, and it shrinks it in the name, supposedly, of the people. This is where I'll leave these comments. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Fabulous.
Now we're going to hear from Arturo Escobar.